Welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is the first of a series of discussions of the respiratory system. The respiratory system is in many ways very familiar. It's the way that we bring air, fresh air full of oxygen into the body to support the cellular respiration. But it's also an organ of compensation for blood pH. We kind of jumped ahead and talked about the kidneys already, which control pH of the blood over the long term. But the lungs represent an organ system that can make adjustments in pH in the shorter term. So we'll talk about that this chapter. Of course, the respiratory system also is involved in the sense of smell, bringing some air into the nasal cavity with some volatile chemicals that we can smell, and speech. Respiration. We've been talking about respiration quite a bit over the first semester, especially in the chapter on muscles, chapter 9. We talked about cellular respiration as the processes by which the muscle cells can extract energy from fuel molecules and store in the form of ATP, which can then be used for cross-bridge cycling and muscle contraction. Well, in this chapter, we're going to use the term respiration entirely to mean moving air, fresh air, into the respiratory system, and then the movement of oxygen from that fresh air into the blood, and then later on from the blood to the tissues. So external respiration refers to the movement of oxygen into the blood from the alveoli, the air sacs of the lungs, and the movement of CO2 from the blood into the alveoli. So that exchange of gases in the lungs. Internal respiration, once we deliver that oxygen-rich blood to all the capillary beds of the body, refers to the exchange of gases in the tissues. So oxygen will diffuse out of the blood into the extracellular fluid, which can then be grabbed by the cells for, again, producing ATP for cellular respiration. Ventilation is the term we'll use for the movement, just the air pumping. The lungs are kind of like an air pump, and we will be bringing air in and out of that system in just volumes of air. That's ventilation. So the major organs of the respiratory system include the airways, the conducting zone, getting the air into the lungs, and that includes the nasal cavity, the pharynx, that are throat, the larynx, your voice box, the trachea, and the bronchi, and many branched bronchi going down into the lungs. And then once we get way down in through 23 or so branches of bronchi, we reach the microscopic air sacs, or alveoli, where the actual gas exchange happens. And we must include in our discussion very briefly muscles of respiration. Again, we're talking about the movement of air in this case, and we'll talk mainly about the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, although during exercise a number of muscles actually contribute to the changes in volume of the thoracic cavity. So here's a little cartoon schematic drawing showing the organs. We have the air entering into the nasal cavity, then into the pharynx, this area posterior, and then through the larynx. It's like a boundary here, into the trachea, and then the branching bronchi and down into the lungs. Here's the diaphragm muscle, this dome-shaped muscle, which will allow us to inflate the lungs at rest, bring some air in there. And we'll also notice there are muscles situated, sheets of muscles situated between the ribs called intercostal muscles, and they're also involved in making changes that will bring air in and out of the lungs. So the first part of what's called the upper respiratory tract or system is the nasal cavity. It has a number of functions, very important functions. As air enters into the nasal cavity, it's kind of dry and cold relative to the conditions in your body, and so a lot of water evaporates from the surface of the mucous membrane in your nasal cavity, and humidifies the air. We want the air to be saturated with water vapor so that when it goes down into those delicate air sacs in the lungs, it doesn't dry them out. So we're going to add all the water that air can hold. We're going to warm it up to body temperature as well. And part of the way we do that is by producing or having a lot of surface area, structures in the nasal cavity that increase the surface area so that we can make sure the air comes in contact with a moist surface and get some water to evaporate into that air and warm it up. Interestingly, when you expire air back out, it begins to cool off as it gets farther and farther, closer and closer to the outside, and the water, as the temperature drops, the moisture condenses back out and actually forms droplets on the mucous membrane and hairs that are in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity serves to not only humidify and moisten the air, it will actually filter out dust, debris, bacteria, and so forth that we inspire regularly in the air. It'll cling to the mucus on the surface of the hairs and the mucous membranes that are in the nasal cavity for the most part. And also the nasal cavity is a resonating chamber. If you think of the function of the hollow wooden box of a acoustic guitar or of other types of stringed instruments, those are resonating chambers that help kind of amplify the sound, give it its character so that it then travels out into space and produces the characteristic sounds. And the resonant chambers of the respiratory system, including the sinuses as well as the nasal cavity, give rise to the qualities of our speech. And the olfactory sensors are in the nasal cavity, on the roof of the nasal cavity. I stuck in a little review here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I encourage you to take a look. We spent some time in the first half of this course talking about bones of the skeleton, and we examined all the bones of the skull, the cranium in detail. So I thought I would review that with you just really quickly. So what bones, I asked you this back then, what bones contribute to the formation or the structure of the nasal cavity? And so we can look at this diagram and see if this is the nasal cavity. We see this maxilla here, the two paired maxilla. We can see just the very bottom in blue of the vomer bone, which is part of the vertical divider between the left and right nasal cavities. These orange colored structures are part of the ethmoid bone, and they form the nasal concha, as well as or at least a couple of the pairs of nasal concha and the perpendicular plate that divides the two halves. Here's the inferior nasal concha, another surface area generating bone of the nasal cavity. You can see in this drawing the maxilla forms part of the floor of the nasal cavity here, palatine process, and then the palatine bone forms more of the floor of the nasal cavity. We can here again see the vomer a little bit better, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone has some contribution there. And here's just another inferior view. Palatine process of the maxilla, palatine bone, vomer, sphenoid. So I just listed them out here, and so that you make sure you caught them all in that quick review. All right, the upper respiratory tract includes all the structures superior to the larynx. The larynx, again, is that voice box, that Adam's apple bulge in your throat, in your anterior of your neck. The upper respiratory tract is the home for many different types of bacteria and fungi. And that might seem weird, but that's where a lot of so-called commensal organisms live. They're organisms that occupy regions of our body, the surface of our body, the nasal cavity, the GI tract, and they're harmless organisms. They just happen to exist there, and in fact, some cases they produce benefits to the body. So commensal organisms live in the upper respiratory tract in large quantities. The lower respiratory tract is different. There aren't microorganisms living there. They may escape down into there temporarily, but they'll be swept out and disposed of. The lower respiratory tract includes all the structures inferior to the larynx, so the trachea, the bronchi, and the alveoli. There's a specialized epithelium in the nasal cavity, in the sinuses, as well as in those airways of the lower respiratory system, a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which eventually morphs into a ciliated cuboidal epithelium. But the point is, the cilia are these motorized whip-like hairs covered with a layer of mucus on this mucous membrane that can capture dust, debris, and bacteria and so forth that enter into the respiratory system, and in the nasal cavity sweep them posteriorly to be swallowed down into the stomach, or in the lower respiratory system swept up to the larynx and then eventually swallowed down into the stomach, where they'll be destroyed. So here's a diagram showing a little bit more detail of the respiratory system structures, or some of them. Here we see the nasal cavity. Air enters into the nasal cavity and is warmed and humidified by turbulent movement of air around these nasal concha, and that also serves to humidify the air. The air then moves into the pharynx, and then into the larynx, and down to the trachea. So I just drew a little line here to sort of remind you that everything's superior to the larynx represents the upper respiratory system structures. Interestingly, we just finished talking about the immune system. We see in this diagram a number of clusters of tonsils, concentrations of tonsils, which are regions of lymphoid tissue in the pharynx and on the posterior of the tongue here. So we have the pharyngeal tonsils at the superior part of the pharynx. There's a so-called tubal tonsil here around the opening to the tube that enters into the middle ear, the pharyngotympanic tube. There's a tonsil on the soft palate. There's this muscular structure that extends from the hard palate posteriorly and inferiorly. So there's that palatine tonsil, and then there's a lingual tonsil on the base of the tongue. So those get a little sample of whatever's coming into the body through the air that's inspired and through the diet, so that we can get a leg up on providing an adaptive immune response if needed to whatever microbes are coming into the body. There's a little cadaver dissection showing the structures. You can especially see the nasal concha, these sort of curved balconies of bone covered by mucous membrane and hairs, which you don't see so much in here, that allow the air to come in contact to humidify, warm, and be filtered of debris and so forth. If some viruses that are of the appropriate sort have the appropriate host range to infect the mucosa of the nasal cavity, we'll have rhinitis, an inflammatory condition in the nasal cavity. And that, of course, can travel from the nasal cavity to other parts of the respiratory tract or not. And we may have simply some inflammation there that will cause a runny nose and so forth. And but it may travel down into the trachea and bronchi and cause a cough. It can also cause inflammation in the sinuses, those hollow areas in the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone. And if it so happens that the inflammation blocks the opening to one of those air-filled sinuses, there's a mucous membrane in there as well. There will be production of mucus in there and accumulation of fluid, and there may be a painful condition, a sinus headache produced by the air sort of diffusing into the fluids and forming a vacuum in those sinuses, or possibly there might be a secondary infection that occurs in there by bacteria that begin to multiply that are trapped in those chambers, the maxillary sinus I failed to mention. So the air enters in the nasal cavity and into the pharynx. The pharynx is actually divided into 3 separate regions according to what structure they lie posterior to. So that we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx posterior to the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx posterior to the larynx. And then the air enters into the larynx. The larynx is like a stiff cartilage box that provides a housing, a structure for the vocal cords that we use for a number of purposes, the most familiar with which is probably producing the sounds of speech with a little help from various muscles, the tongue and the lips and so forth. It's mainly constructed of 2 large cartilage rings, some hyaline cartilage rings. The thyroid cartilage has a large bulky anterior section, and then immediately inferior to that is the cricoid cartilage, which has a large bulky posterior section, and they form a stiff cartilage container essentially, or chamber in which the vocal cords lie. The larynx is blocked or protected by a valve, the epiglottis. There's a fleshy trap door, essentially, flap of tissue just over the larynx, and it has in its structure some elastic cartilage that allows it to fold down over the larynx during swallowing. So here, this whitish color represents cartilage in this cartoon rendering. So that's the epiglottis, and here's the larynx. And during breathing, the epiglottis is open, but during swallowing it folds down and closes off the entrance to the trachea, so to larynx and trachea, so that whatever's in your oral cavity will travel down through the esophagus, and there won't be a difficult situation that arises from debris getting down into anything other than air that gets into the larynx and trachea will cause a paroxysmal reaction of coughing and sneezing. So here's the larynx. The larynx is protected again by the epiglottis. Here's a little bit more detailed cartoon drawing of the epiglottis, which can again can seal off here. When you swallow, also the soft palate will clamp across to the posterior of the pharynx, so that nothing from the oral cavity can then get up into the nasal cavity. Everything must go down into the esophagus during swallowing. Anyway, here's the larynx. That you can see the bulky anterior of the thyroid cartilage and the bulky posterior of the cricoid cartilage that form this structure. And here you can see the vocal cords or vocal ligaments in there, and we'll take a closer look at that, those structures of the larynx. So here's a anterior view of the larynx, showing the hyaline cartilage structures, the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and then rings of cartilage continue all the way down the trachea and the bronchi and the branching bronchi. They're actually called C rings because they don't, you can see here they've carefully drawn no cartilage here in this mid-sagittal view of the trachea, because the cartilage rings terminate before they meet at the posterior, so that there's just some smooth muscle here in the posterior of the larynx to, for among other reasons, allow swallowing to take place. So these C rings keep the airways open. Only tiny differences in pressure drive the flow of air in and out of the airways, the respiratory system, and so we need to keep the resistance very, very low in there. So the larynx consists of this box in which the vocal cords or vocal folds are located. They extend from anterior to posterior across the opening of the larynx, and then laterally, they're attached to the walls of the larynx by an accordion-like tissue structures, including the so-called vestibular folds, and there's some muscles in there that can control those vocal structures. The glottis is the name of the valve that's formed by those vocal ligaments when they're drawn closed across the opening to the larynx. So we got a valve before the larynx, the epiglottis, and then we have a valve within the larynx called the glottis, and you can close off the access to the trachea and the lower respiratory system by closing the glottis. Pairs of arytenoid muscles will contract and cause pivoting of the arytenoid cartilages, which tense and adduct those vocal ligaments and close off the opening to the trachea, the glottis, forcing air through the opening, through the space, or just forcing air between the vocal ligaments when the glottis is closed will cause this vibrations which are audible. So here in this drawing we can see the vocal ligament or vocal cord here stretching from anterior to posterior, and it's attached to this arytenoid cartilage, which in turn is connected to three pairs of muscles, arytenoid muscles, that can pivot this arytenoid cartilage, this lever-like cartilage, and pull these vocal ligaments closed across the opening of the larynx. There are other paired muscles that allow opening of those ligaments as well. Again, here you can see the cartilage rings. There's some smooth muscle that forms the posterior wall of the trachea. Here's a superior view of the larynx. We can see with the glottis closed that the vocal ligaments have been adducted and pulled tight across the opening of the larynx, and the so-called vocal or vestibular folds, here, as well as some other tissues and muscles, form a closure, so that when those vocal ligaments are snuggled up against each other, there's no access to through the larynx to the trachea. While a pair of muscles can open up or abduct these vocal ligaments and allow airflow through and into the lower respiratory tract for breathing, ventilation. So when we make sounds of speech, we use those paired muscles to adduct and tense the vocal ligaments or vocal cords, and we force air by raising the pressure of air inside the thorax, force air up through between those ligaments, and they begin to vibrate. The tighter we pull those vocal ligaments and then force air up through, the higher the pitch of sound that will produce. The frequency of sound determines the pitch, and the tighter the cords, the higher the pitch. The pitch is also affected by the dimensions of the larynx and the vocal cords, and that's kind of a built-in thing. If you have a large larynx with long vocal cords, you'll have lower frequency sounds being produced on average, have a deeper voice, and a smaller, shorter vocal cords will cause a higher pitched sound to be produced. The loudness of the sound depends on the amount of air pressure in the thorax when it's being forced through the vocal cords. So if you really do some muscular work to get the pressure up down there and force the air through those vocal ligaments, we'll have a loud noise being produced, relatively speaking. Valsalva's maneuver refers to another function of the glottis. If we want to stiffen, stabilize the core structure of the torso in order to transfer a load from the pectoral girdle and system, the arms and shoulders, down through the torso to the pelvic girdle and possibly to the legs if we're standing up. We need to stabilize the core of the body, the torso, and that's done by closing the glottis tightly and then contracting the muscles of the abdominal wall and intercostal muscles that will compress the air in the respiratory system and compress the contents of the abdominal cavity and stiffen the whole thing like a rigid cylinder. So that's an important process. Whenever we pick up anything essentially and carry it around with us, we need to, especially if it's very heavy, then we're going to close the glottis in order to get the stiffness we need in that core of the body. Also, we can use the abdominal muscles to help with defecation. We can perform Valsalva's maneuver, close the glottis, contract those muscles of the abdominal wall, raising the pressure in there, which will help evacuate the rectum. Also, during coughing and sneezing, we can close the glottis, raise the pressure very, very high in the respiratory tract by compressing the air that's in there, and then suddenly opening the glottis, and air will rush out through the larynx and out through the upper respiratory system with great velocity, and in so doing, some shear forces will be produced, which will strip mucus or other debris off the surfaces of the trachea and larynx and propel them out of the body through the oral cavity and nasal cavity. So that's our discussion of the upper respiratory tract and the larynx. The next time, in our second part on the respiratory system, we will talk about the lower respiratory tract and some functions of the lower respiratory system and some properties of gases that are in the air that we breathe.